Going beyond the headlines. Asking the questions you want answered. Exploring government policies and how they impact you. We are delving deeper.
Good evening and welcome to Delving Deeper. I am your host, Ayana Carter. Almost 1 year ago, Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, Dr. the Honorable Amory Brown, indicated on this show that Trinidad and Tobago was vying for the presidency of the United Nations General Assembly. Let's take a look at what he said at that time.
We are very well regarded on the international stage at this time. We're seeking to leverage that even further in our candidature for the presidency of the UN General Assembly for the upcoming term, 2023 to 2024. Trinidad and Tobago has never held such a position. It's our intention, and we intend to succeed. It's our intention to do exactly that. As a small country, holding the seat of the presidency of the General Assembly of the United Nations, reflecting our principles, reflecting our voice, reflecting our aspirations, and our appreciation of the challenges facing developing countries and small island states on the global stage.
On June 1st, His Excellency Ambassador Dennis Francis, a veteran diplomat, was elected President of the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly. He's joining us now via Zoom from the Permanent Mission of Trinidad and Tobago to the United Nations in New York. Good evening, Ambassador Francis. Congratulations on your historic appointment, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us on this week's episode of Delving Deeper.
It's a pleasure being with you, Ayan.
Now tell us, who is Ambassador Dennis Francis?
Let me start with who Dennis Francis is, because he then went on to become Ambassador Francis. Dennis Francis is the last of 6 siblings, born to working class parents, born and grew up in Bossier, number 2, Maraval. Ran around with other kids, played football and cricket, went into the bush, as we used to call it as children, to pick mangoes during August vacation, and did all the regular things that children did in those days. Now it's different because kids play indoors with electronic games, and in my time we didn't have those. We made lasting connections and friendships with each other. I was supposedly a bright kid, and so when I did not achieve my first choice in common entrance, which was QRC, I went to Woodbrook Secondary School. My common entrance teachers told my parents I should not be going to Woodbrook Secondary School. I should be going to QRC. And they offered to arrange a transfer for me 1 month after I started attending Woodbrook Secondary. And I refused to go anywhere else but Woodbrook Secondary. That is significant. And I did not see the need to change. And I remember saying to my parents, I can do well wherever I go. It doesn't matter. So Dennis Francis always had the ambition to do well and got the support of his parents and his siblings, nurtured on strong values of working hard, applying yourself, being diligent, being respectful to your elders, respecting your teachers, and not depending on anybody but yourself to get ahead in life. In other words, no one owed you anything. You had to work to be successful because that was just the nature of things. So I did not come from a privileged background. I was never poor. There was always more than enough to eat and drink. I never went to bed or went to sleep hungry or missed a meal anytime. But those values taught me really about applying oneself to the task at hand and being grateful to God for all the little things and the big things that He graced us with.
And how were you able to apply that heading into the UN and now finally as president of the UN General Assembly?
You notice I said that I went to Woodbrook Secondary. I met at Woodbrook Secondary some people who would be my lifelong friends. We've been friends for 55 years. And we continue today to be reliable friends in each other's lives. We support each other, birthdays, funerals, anniversaries, graduations, grandkids, what have you, we are there for each other.
Ambassador, what does it mean to you to be the first TNT national to be elected president of the United Nations General Assembly?
Well, it's quite an honor and a privilege, but also there's a big aspect of realism to it, because the fact of the matter is really that insofar as I'm aware, and I've been in the Foreign Service for altogether maybe 44, 45 years, I do not believe Trinidad and Tobago has ever before put up a candidate for the presidency of the General Assembly. We've had candidacies for other roles in the UN, but never before for the presidency. So this is groundbreaking in the sense that it's the first time. But we must also bear in mind that it is the first time we've ever stood for that office. So it's quite an honor and a privilege. But I should also say, it is quite a heavy responsibility and not one to be taken lightly in any way, because the President of the General Assembly is has an extremely important role to play in the conduct of the negotiations that go on in the United Nations. And the international community expects the President of the General Assembly to execute that function fairly, transparently, and justly. And that is precisely how I am going to be doing it.
Now, Ambassador, for those of our viewers who may not be familiar with your new role, can you just give us some information on the role and function of the President of the UN General Assembly?
If you could imagine, the General Assembly is sort of the parliament of parliaments. It's sort of the global parliament. The General Assembly consists of 193 independent states. The President of the General Assembly is elected by the 193 member states. And it is the role of the President to administer the rules of the Assembly in a similar way as we have the Honorable Bridget Anita George presiding as Speaker of the House of Representatives. The President of the General Assembly presides over the operations of the General Assembly. He or she is the face of the Assembly. He or she speaks publicly on behalf of the General Assembly, and so must be careful to capture accurately the essence of the work and the mood and the orientation of the General Assembly in order to ensure that the general public is kept au courant in step with what is taking place in the Assembly. So the President administers the rules of procedure of the Assembly. But in addition to that, the President sets the agenda of the work program of the General Assembly for the year in which he or she sits as President. In addition to which, he consults with the various groups and subgroups in the Assembly to test the mood of the Assembly in order to ensure that he is being consistent with the prevailing atmosphere in the Assembly. So it's multidimensional. When the negotiations, when and if the negotiations get snarled, it will be the proper function of the President to explore ways and means of unblocking the negotiations, getting them restarted, which sometimes has to take place behind the scenes, not in an open conference room, because there are lots of political sensitivities. And so that process can take place in a very subtle way in order to get the negotiations started. Once the negotiations come to a halt, no progress can be made. The level of frustration in the House increases, the level of disillusionment increases, and that makes the possibility of coming to an agreement that much more difficult. So we try as much as we can to avoid complicating the atmosphere of the negotiations in order that there can be progress towards a commonly accepted outcome, something we call consensus.
What do you plan to achieve during your tenure as president?
That's a big question because there are many challenges before us. But in a nutshell, in 2015, the United Nations adopted something called Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. At the core of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs was the commitment to rid the world of poverty and hunger, and to address several other social, economic, and humanitarian issues that have compounded life on this planet for people all over the world. It was a broad agenda, Agenda 2030. Unfortunately, we are going in the opposite direction. The SDGs are off track, and if something radical does not happen from now on until 2030, many of the SDGs, including the one dealing with getting rid of poverty and reducing global hunger, will not be achieved. And so it's my big hope that we will make a valiant effort between now and 2030 in order to kickstart progress towards attaining Agenda 2030 and particularly dealing with hunger and poverty. But if we can't do it all, because it's a massive agenda, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 189, I think, targets. So it is a mammoth undertaking, and we've only 7 years left. But I believe we must be able, come 2030, to say, without fear of contradiction, that as the UN, we made our best effort to achieve Agenda 2030. Some of it we got done right. Some of it might still be lagging behind, but those threads can be picked up and continued into the period beyond 2030. And so I believe we must continue to do some heavy lifting to deal with hunger in the world, poverty, excessive poverty in the world, to deal with issues of education and issues around health in particular. There are other important things. I'm not saying that those are unimportant, but those are at the core. Those four, I think, are at the core of what constitutes important human expectations and that give people everywhere dignity and respect. And I think the UN has an obligation, a moral obligation, to fight that fight.
How do you see Trinidad and Tobago, and by extension, CARICOM, benefiting from your tenure?
There's no doubt about it. There is often the perception in many places, influential and perhaps not so influential, that the world is dominated only by large, powerful countries with large, powerful interests. You know, big mega corporations, mega banks, etc. And that small countries like ours are on the fringes of the international system, really do not have an important role to play. My election as President of the General Assembly demonstrates, in fact, that small countries, and if I'm not mistaken, small countries comprise close to 2/3, I think it's 95 of the 193 countries are regarded as small countries, many of them small island developing states like Trinidad and Tobago. We do play an important role in the system. So because it is a system based not per se on raw power, but on the power of ideas, the power of argument and debate. And I like to say, I tell my staff all the time, and I say to other colleagues, that no country in the world, regardless of how large or how small, has a monopoly on intellect. Trinidad and Tobago is a small country where only 1.3 million people, but we've got a strong, strong history and record on intellect and on scholarship. That is the gift of Dr. Eric Williams to our country. And it continues to be a strong characteristic of the country. We know that we are very opinionated people in Trinidad and Tobago. We hear it on the talk shows every day, how articulate the people are. That is the gift that Dr. Williams bequeathed to us. And so it is not beyond our capacity in any way, shape, or form to represent ourselves and to put forward big ideas, impressive ideas that can make a difference globally. So CARICOM in the UN has been doing that. We have got a caucus of CARICOM permanent representatives. We meet regularly and discuss and coordinate on various issues. And we often speak as CARICOM from time to time with considerable impact and appeal in the House. The message being, smallness is not necessarily an impediment. It depends on, like everything else, the extent of your preparation, the extent of your commitment, and your ability to maneuver skillfully between those who have differing points of view, ensuring, as we do, that our view is always one based on our own interests and our own priorities, not determined by any other country's interests or priorities.
Ambassador Francis, you take up duties officially in September. And earlier you mentioned that there will be challenges. You expect that you would face some challenges in this role. What is the biggest challenge, in your opinion, that you will be facing during your tenure?
The biggest challenge is the existing atmosphere in the negotiations. There's, because of a number of things that have happened, including the war in Ukraine, the war with Russia, the pandemic, the global supply chain disruptions that have caused the food crisis and the energy crisis, the high cost of living. All of these things have come together at a time of great difficulty and that have really challenged countries and economies to cope. Right in our neighborhood in the Caribbean, there are a number of countries that are under extreme economic strain. But let me say quickly, It's not just in the Caribbean, it's across the globe. The same thing is happening in the Pacific, in parts of Africa, in parts of Asia, because we are really living in an extraordinary time period. No one anticipated a pandemic. And I don't think anyone quite understood the extent to which the pandemic, most of which the science tells us has receded, but its effects linger. They linger every day. And so countries are really under extreme pressure with debts rising, low fiscal space, tax collections down, tourist arrivals down. It's all bad news. So that that has contrived to create a very difficult negotiating environment. Because the whole thrust of the SDGs is that countries need to undertake certain reforms, to implement certain reforms that would make their economies and societies better, more agile, more efficient. However, those reforms cost money to implement, money that they do not have and cannot afford. And with all that's going on in the world globally with the geopolitical situation, who are in a position to provide financing have their own issues and are not in a hurry, so to speak, to provide additional financing. So climate finance, which is an extremely important consideration for countries in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, the SIDS, Small Islands Developing States. Climate finance has been extremely disappointing. The level of commitment adopted by developed countries, extremely disappointing. And so it's a very difficult moment in diplomatic negotiations on climate change, on the Sustainable Development Goals, because there is now a pervasive lack of trust between the two sides, the global north and the global south. Part of what I am hoping to do is to change that atmosphere, because at the moment it's putrid. To try to change that atmosphere, to try to re-inject into the ambience of the negotiations, an atmosphere of civility and conviviality, of cooperation and conciliation, in order to get people really talking and listening to each other, rather than regurgitating on every sitting the same prepared text that simply present a position that in some ways might be doctrinaire, rather than listening and responding to what your counterpart is proposing. So it is not going to be easy because the conditions, the atmospherics, as we say out there, will not make it easy. But be that as it may, we have a commitment. We give a commitment to the international community and to poor people everywhere. And it is a matter of honor that we should uphold that commitment, because even in the difficult circumstances, more can and must be done to support development globally.
Mm-hmm. Given all that's happening in Trinidad and Tobago and certainly around the globe, if you had to send a message to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, what would that message be?
I would first like to send a message to the students of Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Williams told us 63 or 64 years ago, the future of the nation lies in your school bags. Every time I have heard that speech, I felt as if Dr. Williams was speaking to me personally. The fact of the matter is that 63 years later, that statement still rings true. The future of the nation does lie in the nation's children's school bag. And I'm saying this because I want the students of Trinidad and Tobago to apply themselves, to be diligent and disciplined, and to feel that they can be successful too, because they can. I'm the living example, not from a house of privilege. And I rose to become the president of the General Assembly. Many of those children will make us proud in the future by becoming doctors, physiotherapists, radiation oncologists, maybe even astronauts. We don't know. And I would say to the adults, invest in and nurture your children and their education. Nurture your children and their education, because that is what will set them free and give them a chance to self-actualize and to make the finest contribution they can make to Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago has given us all a lot. We all owe it back something. It's time to pay it back.
As we close, Ambassador Francis, is there anything else you would like to share with us?
If I may, Ayana, I'd like to shout out my special students at Woodbrook Government Secondary School, my alma mater. I understand that they've gone wild since my election on the 1st of June. They've created a banner and hung it at the front of the school with great pride. They've had competitions in the school for Father's Day, and the one that won was some sort of motif with my face and my name printed on the back of one of the schoolboy shirts. I want to say to them, I have done it. You can do it too. It might not be in diplomacy. It might be in mathematics, research. In fact, when I was in high school, I wanted to become a research cytologist. Look at where I am. I'm in diplomacy. So continue to study hard, respect your teachers, do your homework every day. And most importantly, read. Read a lot. Read the newspapers. Read books. Read magazines. I know you have to do what young people do. That's part of growing up and becoming an adult. But so much of what is important and that you will need to know, you will find in other places, but in places other than video games and computer games. Read a whole lot and ask questions. Be respectful to your teachers. I'm hoping one day soon, sooner rather than later, I'll be able to come to Trinidad and visit the school and meet with all of you in person to thank you for the love and support that you have shown me and to return that love and support.
That will certainly be an exciting time for you to visit your alma mater. We're looking forward to that, and I'm sure they're looking forward to it as well.
I'm very much looking forward to it. Because if I can inspire one more, or all of them, that is exactly what I would like to do. And not just Woodbrook Secondary, all the kids in the school system. Reach for the stars. You can get there.
Thank you, Ambassador. And that's our show. We'd like to thank Ambassador Dennis Francis for joining us on this week's episode of Delving Deeper.
Thank you, Ayana.
Join us at the same time next week for another episode of Delving Deeper. I am your host, Ayana Carter, and from all of us here, have a good night.